we start our semester creating a framework of how to think about diversity and inequality. So, at this point in time, I'd like to briefly discuss first the idea of diversity, and after we do that, the concept of inequality. As a starting point, I want to discuss the idea that we're working with the concept of diversity, referring to the idea that there are differences between groups of people, and that when we are referring to social diversity, that what we were talking about are differences between cultures and differences in how people are perceived, which is created more by social definitions, and we're going to get to that idea, meaning social construction. Many times these differences can include things like ethnicity, lifestyle, languages, tastes, preferences for anything from hairstyles to clothing, or in general how we present ourselves. So from this idea of us having preferences, one would then ask, where do these preferences come from? And the answer to that is they're cultural, at least for the most part. Now, I don't want to discount the sociobiological, because I think there's always some relevance to acknowledging that there are certain preferences that human beings have that may not necessarily be completely cultural in origins. And examples for that might be things like preferences for sweets, or a young child's preferences for foods that are not green, or that there are certain gestures that indicate sexual receptivity, or physical characteristics such as facial symmetry or a certain hip-to-waist ratio that are desirable in a mate. But by and large, our preferences vary across culture and are something that are learned by social reinforcement, which is the idea of cultural transmission. So there's this aspect of social construction that's relevant to diversity. How we tend to present ourselves and how we perceive others is socially constructed and varies from one culture to another. So then, of course, that may, in your minds, beg the question of what exactly does this professor mean when she's referring to culture? In general, the term culture is referring to the characteristics and knowledge of a particular group of people, and this in turn is defined by everything from language, religion, foods and cuisine, social habits, music, and arts. Things that we just referred to when we started discussing the concept of diversity. Now, if you want to think a little deeper about this term, the Center for Advanced Research on Language Acquisition goes a step further, defining culture as shared patterns of behaviors and interactions, cognitive constructs, and understandings that are learned by socialization. So you could say, too, that culture is seen as the growth of a group identity fostered by social patterns unique to the group. So now we've got a very basic concept, this idea of difference or social diversity. That's our starting point. We'll juxtapose this with the idea of inequality. In some ways, we'll be looking at the intersectionality of diversity with inequality throughout the entire semester. So the concept of inequality is, of course, another basic concept that we want to think about a little bit so that we understand that there are different dimensions or different ways to see inequality. There is the more financial idea of inequality, and this is what social scientists often refer to as personal inequality. There's the more social component of inequality, and that's what social scientists would refer to as racial inequality or gender inequality. That social component of inequality is referring to the different ways in which different subgroups are treated by society. So at times during this course, we'll talk about diversity and differences, and at times we'll be discussing how these differences result in social inequality or differential treatment of the subgroups. We'll be considering these different groups and talking about racial differences, gender differences, and sexual orientation and identity. Newman's book looks at these subgroups and is considering the intersection of race, class, gender, and sexuality. His first chapter wants you to grapple with the idea of social construction, or how we create the categories, how we think about them, and how this may ultimately lead to differences in how people are treated, both on an individual level and a social level. So our next step is to start considering the idea of social construction. Now, this is one of the theoretical paradigms in sociology. The basic idea is that people create much of the social reality in which they operate. Things or actions may be finite and real, but the meaning behind these actions is negotiated through social process. The social construction of reality is based on the premise that persons and groups interacting in a social system create, over time, concepts or mental representations of each other's actions. These concepts and the meaning behind these concepts eventually become habituated into reciprocal roles played by the actors in relation to each other. Eventually, these roles, ideas, behaviors, and gestures become institutionalized, meaning they take place without us even thinking about them, and become automatic. In other words, through this process of institutionalization, meaning becomes embedded in society. Knowledge in people's conception and their beliefs of what reality is becomes embedded in the institutional fabric of society. Reality is therefore said to be socially constructed. The sociologist Edmund Bergler developed this concept of the social construction of reality. At this point, I want you to stop and consider the importance of language. It's one of the chief, albeit not the only, manner of communication. Language could be thought of as the use of verbal or written symbols in the conveyance of meaning. And language plays an important role in the analysis of integration of everyday reality. Language links up the common sense knowledge with finite verbal or written symbols through understandings that are relevant to the sender and the receiver.